Toddler discovered a German shepherd trapped in a pipe. What she did made her a hero. What if I told you there's a story so powerful, it'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the world? A story where a child's courage and a dog's loyalty create a bond that defies all odds. What happens next will leave you speechless. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is one you won't want to miss. The morning sun had just begun to stretch its fingers across the quiet lawns of Maple Hollow when little Mia wandered out the back door, clutching a juice box in one hand and a crumpled teddy bear in the other. Her mother, Olivia, barely noticed. She was inside by the kitchen window, phone to ear, half listening to a long conversation about insurance policies and dentist appointments. It was the kind of suburban morning where everything felt still and harmless, the kind of morning where you don't expect anything to change. Mia toddled across the soft grass in her yellow pajamas, humming a tune only she seemed to know. The breeze was gentle, brushing the wildflowers along the fence like a lullaby. She chased a butterfly for a moment, giggling when it floated just beyond her reach, then paused. Something caught her attention. At first, it was just a sound, faint, thin, like wind scraping through leaves. She tilted her head, curious. Another sound followed, softer this time, more urgent. A small, breathy whimper. Like someone was crying, but not someone. Something. Mia blinked and turned toward the far end of the yard where the grass grew tall and uncut around the old drainage ditch. Most days, she wasn't allowed to go that far. But today, the sound pulled her. She dropped her teddy bear by the flower bed and slowly stepped forward, one foot after the other, her little hands brushing the tall grass aside. The sound grew clearer. It wasn't just wind. It was hurt, afraid, alive. Mia crouched by the edge of the ditch, peering through the weeds, her heart fluttering not from fear but from a strange sense of knowing, as if something was waiting for her. There, almost hidden beneath a layer of rusted metal and mud, was a narrow, corroded pipe jutting out from the earth. It looked like part of the old storm drain system no one had thought about in years. But it wasn't the pipe that caught Mia's eye. It was the glint inside it, the pair of eyes. What? Trembling. She froze. Inside the pipe, just barely visible in the shadows, was a face. A dog's face. A German shepherd, pressed so tightly into the pipe that it seemed almost a part of it. His fur was caked with mud and his eyes were glassy with pain. His nose twitched once. Then again. Another whimper, thin as paper, escaped him. Mia gasped, backing up instinctively, but then stopped. She stared at the pipe, at the creature hidden in it, and did the one thing no one else might have done. She got closer. She lay down flat on her belly in the grass and crept to the edge of the pipe, staring straight in. "Hi," she whispered, unsure if the word meant anything. The dog didn't move. His breath came in slow, shallow puffs. Mia didn't scream or run. She blinked, then reached out and gently placed her small hand near the pipe opening, not touching it, just close enough. And in that moment, the dog let out the faintest sound. Not a growl, not a bark, a sigh. As if, for the first time in days, something had shifted. Back in the kitchen, Olivia turned just in time to realize her daughter was gone. Her heart jumped. She ran out the back door, calling Mia's name. It took seconds for panic to set in, but when she heard her daughter's voice call softly, "Mommy," she followed it, and what she saw would stay with her forever. There was Mia, flat on the ground, face pressed to the dirt, staring into a pipe. "He's stuck," she said without looking up. Olivia rushed forward, scooping her daughter away from the ditch and pulling her to her chest. "Sweetheart, what are you?" But then she saw it too. The rusted pipe, the broken earth, and inside, the barely visible shimmer of movement. A dog, alive. Within minutes, neighbors gathered. Someone called the fire department. Another called animal control. But everyone hesitated near the pipe, unsure what to do. It was buried deep, rusted shut in places, and narrow enough that no adult could reach inside. The fire chief arrived, took one look at the situation, and rubbed his forehead. "We'll need to cut around it. This won't be easy." But while adults panicked and debated, Mia returned to the edge of the ditch, sat quietly, and began humming again, the same little song from earlier that morning. She didn't understand what extraction meant or why everyone seemed so nervous. All she knew was that someone down there needed her. And maybe, somehow, he already knew she was the one who found him first. As the crew began setting up lights and equipment, Olivia crouched beside Mia. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "we're going to help him, okay?" Mia nodded. Her eyes never left the pipe. She whispered one word: "Stay." And inside the dark, rusted hollow, the dog did. Mia's scream shattered the stillness of the morning like a cracked bell in a quiet chapel. It wasn't a tantrum or a sharp cry of fear. It was something else, something raw and confused, something that made Olivia's heart skip as she sprinted across the backyard. She barely registered her daughter's outstretched arm or the wordless panic on her face. Her eyes locked straight onto the pipe, that rusted, mud-streaked tunnel half swallowed by grass and time, and inside it, those eyes. Two trembling eyes, wide and rimmed with grime, stared back at her from the shadows. A German shepherd, the unmistakable face of a dog, stuck so deep into the pipe it was hard to tell where his body began or ended. Only his head was visible, barely, wedged in like something discarded and forgotten. His muzzle was dry and scraped, his breathing shallow and erratic. The pipe clung to him like a second skin, tight and cruel. His gaze didn't shift. It was locked in that terrifying middle place between panic and surrender. Olivia stumbled backward, scooping Mia into her arms. "Get back," she whispered, though her own voice trembled with disbelief. "Get back, baby." Her hand fumbled for her phone, dialing the first number that came to mind. Then the second. Then the fire department. Within 15 minutes, the yard no longer felt like a quiet place. A fire engine rumbled up the street, its siren silenced but its urgency humming like a silent drumbeat. Neighbors emerged from porches, drawn by the motion and confusion. Olivia tried to explain, pointing toward the ditch, her voice catching every few words. A man in uniform with silver hair and a clipboard knelt by the pipe, peering in with a flashlight. The beam caught on the dog's face. The man swore under his breath and stood slowly. "German Shepherd," he said aloud, mostly to himself. "Adult. Maybe 3, 4 years old. He's jammed in there good." Mia sat on the grass nearby, hugging her knees, silent now. Her wide eyes never left the pipe. She watched everything, every motion, every expression. But her focus never shifted from the hollow where the shepherd lay buried in steel. The crew brought tools, bolt cutters, pipe saws, fiber optic cameras. They slid scopes into the pipe to get a better view of his body. The image came up on a tablet, fur matted with filth, ribs visible beneath torn flesh, one back leg twisted awkwardly behind him, barely enough space for him to breathe. One of the medics muttered something about how he was still alive. "Barely." "How long's he been in there?" someone asked. "Too long," someone else answered. A debate broke out among the crew, quietly, professionally, but with a clear edge of tension. If they cut too aggressively, they might startle the dog. If he panicked, he could shift and cause fatal internal damage. If they went too slow, he might not last. Olivia stood nearby, arms folded, trying to listen, trying not to crumble. "We can't wait till morning," she said. "He won't make it." But even the fire chief, seasoned and calm, looked uncertain. "He's wedged in a rusted stormwater pipe," he explained. Metal's corroded. One wrong move, and it collapses inward. We've seen it before. If he shifts wrong, it's over. The weight of that word hung in the air. Over. The end of something, someone, that hadn't even been given a chance. As the fire team argued over tactics and tools, Mia stood up quietly and walked to the edge of the grass. She crouched again, just like before, and leaned close to the pipe. "Hey," she whispered gently, her voice soft enough to drift like a breeze. "I'm still here." The dog didn't react at first. But after a moment, one eye blinked, slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging the sound. Mia smiled just slightly. "You can come out. I promise." Olivia stepped forward, but the fire chief raised a hand. "Let her," he said. "He's calmer with her around." So they waited. A crew of trained responders, grown men and women with experience and certifications, watched silently as a 3-year-old girl sat in the grass, whispering softly to a broken dog inside a pipe. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't protocol. But something about it felt right. Eventually, a strategy formed. They would cut a section of the pipe open from the top, not the end, using a surgical saw, slowly, inch by inch. They would avoid vibrations, brace the surrounding soil, and work with as much silence as possible. The whole process could take hours. But Mia didn't move. She stayed there, hands folded in her lap, voice low and warm, murmuring stories only the dog could hear. She told him about her stuffed bunny, about her favorite jelly beans, about how she fell off the swing once but got back up. She said his name should be Rusty, 'cause the pipe is rusty, but you're not bad. The shepherd didn't answer, of course. But somewhere deep inside the metal, something in him softened. As the sun rose higher, cutting tools buzzed quietly. The pipe groaned as layers were removed. The stench worsened, rot, urine, blood, rust, a foul mix of neglect and time. But they didn't stop. No one left. Olivia paced the yard, her heart thudding with every metallic whine. She kept glancing at Mia, half amazed, half terrified. What if this didn't work? What if he didn't make it? And then, a sudden clatter. A chunk of pipe peeled away. Light rushed in. A gloved hand reached forward. The dog whimpered, not in pain, but in fear. His eyes darted wildly. Mia stood and took a step forward. "It's okay," she said clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're not alone." Something shifted. He stopped thrashing. He blinked. And just like that, he held still. As the tools buzzed and voices exchanged quiet urgency around her, little Mia remained still, crouched low in the grass beside the jagged metal pipe, her hands gently resting on her knees. The world around her felt loud, clanging, sharp, adult, but she stayed in her own soft silence, eyes locked on the shadowed opening where the shepherd's eyes remained. Olivia stood nearby, trying to stay calm, but her heart ached every time she glanced at the motionless dog inside the pipe. The rescuers had spent nearly 2 hours debating options. The metal was corroded, brittle, and dangerously narrow. One wrong cut and the pipe could collapse inward or slice through something vital. They needed to act, but fear of doing the wrong thing had frozen them in place. What no one could see clearly, what the cameras inside the pipe only hinted at, was how tightly the dog was wedged. His ribs were compressed, his back legs twisted behind him, and his muzzle was bleeding from scraping against rusted metal each time he tried to move. His breath was slowing now. It had been shallow before, but now it came with pauses, almost like he was forgetting how to try. Mia slowly inched forward again, unaware of the weight of the moment around her. She leaned in so close that her breath stirred dust from the rim of the pipe. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but strong in its intent. It wasn't what she said that made the rescuers freeze. It was how the dog responded. His eyes flickered. The tremble that had run through his body since morning paused for the first time. A calm came over his face, soft and subtle, as if her tiny voice had reached into that dark place and tugged at something he had hidden away. The fire chief, standing off to the side reviewing yet another plan drawn in the dirt, noticed the shift and raised his hand for silence. He watched as Mia, still seated at the pipe's mouth, kept speaking, unaware of the awe building around her. There was something sacred about the stillness that followed. The wind had calmed, the tools had gone quiet, and the people had fallen into hushed observation, as though instinctively realizing they were witnessing something far more delicate than metal and rescue strategy. The dog's breathing, while still shallow, had steadied. His frantic darting eyes had stopped shifting, and instead, they focused on Mia. She didn't touch him. She didn't move closer. She just stayed, murmuring simple, tender words in the language of children. The kind of language that came without fear, without expectation, without history. Words that sounded like lullabies and secrets shared with stuffed animals. Words that held space for someone who was hurting. The vet, kneeling beside the chief, leaned in and whispered that they were losing their window. The shepherd wouldn't last much longer, not in that position. His legs were likely asleep or worse, injured from the pressure and blood loss. His torso was constricted, and if he stopped breathing again, they might not be able to bring him back. The fire chief took a breath and stepped forward, motioning to the team. The new plan would be riskier than before. They would widen the current opening at the top of the pipe but cut only as far as the shoulder blades. If they could brace the structure and keep it intact long enough to slide his upper body free, they could then rotate him slightly and release the pressure on his hips. It would take perfect timing and complete stillness from the dog. Any struggle and everything could collapse. But something had changed. They all felt it. The shepherd wasn't fighting anymore. He wasn't panicked. His gaze remained steady, not on the blades or the people, but on the girl. Mia, his rescuer, his anchor. The fire chief turned to Olivia, his voice steady but urgent, and asked if Mia could stay exactly where she was. Olivia hesitated, every instinct in her screaming to pull her daughter away from the danger, but she looked at her child, saw the peace in her posture, the gentle focus in her face, and nodded. Mia continued whispering as the first cut sliced through another ring of pipe. Sparks flared but were quickly suppressed. The dog blinked, his eyes heavy, his breaths deliberate. Each motion from the rescue team was made in rhythm with Mia's presence. It was as if her voice had built a bridge between their fear and his pain. When the final section of the pipe was loosened, the vet slid in a padded sling, looped around the shepherd's front legs. One firefighter placed his gloved hands gently under the dog's neck, while another steadied his flank. Mia's words never stopped, flowing like water, keeping him grounded. With a careful pull and a synchronized lift, the shepherd's body began to slide forward. First came his forelegs, then his chest, then, after a brief pause and a tense maneuver, his back legs, twisted and sore but free. The moment his body left the pipe, the crowd held its breath. He was limp, filthy, and motionless, but breathing. Barely. The vet moved quickly, placing an oxygen mask over his muzzle and checking his vitals. Blood pressure low. Heartbeat erratic. But there. Mia stood slowly, her tiny legs shaking, and walked to where they laid him on the stretcher. Olivia tried to stop her, but the fire chief gently held her back again. Mia looked down at the dog whose life she had unknowingly just saved, and softly reached out her hand. Her fingers brushed his paw. The dog didn't move. Then, just as everyone thought he had slipped back into unconsciousness, a sound emerged from his throat. Not a bark, not a growl, but something in between. A soft, broken whine that carried more than pain. It carried recognition, gratitude, and for a second, Just before the paramedics lifted him into the van, his eyes found hers again. And this time, they didn't look afraid. The afternoon sky began to dim as clouds rolled in, casting a pale gray blanket over the backyard that had turned into a rescue zone. The sharp scent of rusted metal mixed with something darker, old blood, wet soil, and the sharp tang of fear. The shepherd still lay wedged in the rusted pipe, but now the team had a plan, and every hand moved with purpose. Heavy-duty cutters were brought in, their jaws thick and sharp, designed for rescue situations where time and pressure could kill. One firefighter knelt beside the pipe's mouth, feeding in a narrow flashlight while another adjusted a thin camera probe, carefully watching the dog's body movements on a small screen. The image showed the shepherd's back leg twisted unnaturally, pressed against the curve of the metal. There was bruising, deep purple beneath the grime, and blood had begun to soak the fur around his hindquarters. He hadn't made a sound in over an hour. That silence was more terrifying than any howl. Mia, still seated on the grass just feet away, whispered gently under her breath. Her voice was steady now, rhythmically soothing, and though her words made little sense to the adults around her, stories about toy bunnies and bedtime songs, the shepherd seemed to cling to the sound like it was the only thread holding him to the world. The fire chief crouched beside the pipe and gave a silent nod. The cutting began. The first sparks flew fast and bright, a soft hiss marking each bite of steel. The pipe shuddered under the pressure, releasing small clouds of rust and mold into the air. A foul stench pushed upward, years of rot, urine, filth trapped inside the tube with the animal. Olivia covered her mouth, tears in her eyes as she watched the men work, her focus flipping constantly between the blinking monitors and the fragile figure of her daughter. Each time the saw bit through a new segment, they paused, waiting to see if the vibrations would trigger panic. But somehow, the shepherd didn't move. His breathing stayed shallow but steady, and his eyes, though half-lidded, stayed loosely focused toward the pipe's entrance where Mia sat like a quiet guardian. Her voice didn't rise or fall. It stayed soft, even, persistent. The fire chief called for padding and braces. With part of the pipe now cut and peeled away, the exposed metal edges were covered in soft foam and cloth to avoid slicing the dog's limbs. One firefighter slowly slid his hand beneath the shepherd's chest, testing for resistance. No growl came. No flinch. Just warmth, barely, and a slight tremor. The vet watching from the side checked her tablet again. His vitals were dropping. Time was a noose tightening around every movement. The smell worsened with each cut, blood, thick and metallic, mixed with the rot of old infections and whatever waste had soaked into the pipe over time. It clung to everything. Close, thin. But no one stopped. Not when Mia was still whispering. Not when the dog was still breathing. The camera screen showed the hind leg bent unnaturally, likely broken in multiple places, and twisted beneath him. They couldn't pull him without untangling it, and the risk of jarring a bone shard into an artery was high. Still, they had no other option. A new section of the pipe was cut, then another. Each inch was a battle between steel and silence. Mia had shifted closer now, not by command but by instinct. She stretched out her hand near the opening, not touching, just letting the shepherd see it was there. Her fingertips were muddy. Her knees stained green from the grass. But her eyes stayed locked. She was too young to know words like trauma or survival, but something deep inside her seemed to understand this moment mattered more than anything else. At last, the main supports were in place. The pipe, now opened in 3 sections, looked like a broken metal cocoon. The vet gave a quiet go-ahead, and the team slid the makeshift stretcher forward, carefully aligning it beneath the shepherd's chest. The moment they lifted, a collective breath held tight across the yard. He groaned, a weak, rasping sound, but didn't resist. They guided his body forward, inch by inch, blood trailing behind him, the weight of his frame heavier than expected. His legs dangled, limp and disjointed. His head rolled sideways, muzzle stained with filth and dried saliva. Mia crawled even closer now, tears streaking down her cheeks without sound. She watched as the team slowly eased the shepherd from the final ring of the pipe. He was free, but he didn't move. For a moment, it felt like the world stopped. The vet was the first to react, pressing her fingers against his chest, whispering rapid numbers to her assistant. A mask was placed over his snout, and a needle slid into his leg. BP's low. He's hypothermic. Go, go, go. The fire crew lifted the stretcher and began moving toward the ambulance van waiting nearby. Olivia stepped forward, grabbing Mia before she could follow too close. But Mia wasn't looking at her mother. She was staring at the shepherd, her shepherd, now lying still on a blanket, tubes snaking around him like vines. She buried her face in her mother's neck and finally let the sobs come. The quiet, aching sobs of a child who had held in the world too long. But just as the van doors opened and the vet reached to check the dog's pulse again, a faint shift happened. His chest rose. Shallow, almost invisible, but it rose. The vet looked down, held still, and then called out, "He's breathing." The smallest ripple of hope passed through the crowd. Not celebration. Not yet. But something close. Mia, hearing those words, peeked through her mother's shoulder and watched the van doors close around the only friend she'd made that day. And somewhere inside her heart, she already knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the moment the shadows began to lift. The Animal Trauma Center stood like a quiet fortress on the edge of town, all glass walls and silver railings. But behind its sterile architecture was a place full of stories that never made headlines, survivors, losses, beginnings, and too many ends. As the ambulance pulled up, the doors swung open with soft urgency, and the vet team waiting inside moved like clockwork. The German shepherd, still nameless, still barely breathing, was wheeled in on a stretcher wrapped in blood-stained blankets and silent prayers. His fur, once thick and proud, was patchy and matted now, his frame little more than skin stretched over broken angles. The trauma vet, Dr. Evelyn Reyes, met them at the door, clipboard in one hand, stethoscope already around her neck. She took one look at him and her face changed, not with surprise, but with a grim sort of recognition. She'd seen this before. Not the pipe, not the rescue, but the body. The signs. The damage. Within minutes, the dog was taken into a sterile operating space where machines hummed and whispered numbers faster than words could keep up. Blood work was ordered. X-rays were taken. IVs were inserted into collapsed veins that barely held form. The monitors blinked red warnings every few seconds. His hip was fractured badly, crushed slowly over time, likely from the constant pressure of being pinned inside the narrow metal pipe. His ribs were bruised, possibly cracked, and his stomach lining showed signs of starvation so prolonged it had begun to damage the surrounding organs. His dehydration was critical, but worse still was the internal bleeding, a slow leak, silent and invisible, draining life second by second. Dr. Reyes moved between the screens with practiced calm, but even her steady hands tightened at the numbers she saw. When Olivia asked softly from the corner of the room, "Will he make it?" the vet didn't answer right away. She looked down at the shepherd, whose chest rose in tiny, stubborn gasps, and then simply said, "Only if he still wants to." In the waiting room just outside, Mia sat curled up on the leather bench, her knees pulled to her chest, her tiny arms wrapped around her favorite stuffed bunny. The toy was old, its fabric faded, one ear barely hanging on by a thread. But she clutched it tightly, her gaze locked on the double doors that had closed behind the dog she'd refused to leave hours ago. She hadn't spoken much since arriving. Her energy had faded, her voice gone quieter than usual. But every so often, she would whisper something to herself, too low for Olivia to hear. Finally, as the fluorescent lights buzzed above and the clock on the wall ticked with clinical detachment, Mia leaned over and pressed her cheek against her mother's arm. Her voice was no louder than a breath. "He's waiting for me," she said, not with sadness, not with fear, but with certainty. Olivia looked down, surprised by the calm in her daughter's tone. There was no desperation in it, only a truth too small and too big to explain. Inside the medical room, the dog's eyes remained closed, but his body still clung to breath. A vet tech adjusted his position slightly, sliding a soft pad beneath his hips. As they moved him, a small whimper escaped his throat, a sound full of exhaustion more than pain. Dr. Reyes paused and watched the monitors spike slightly. The dog had heard something, or felt something. Or maybe, somewhere deep inside his broken frame, something had reminded him he wasn't entirely alone. She thought of what Mia had said at the scene, how he didn't shake when she spoke, how his eyes followed her, how he only seemed alive when she was near. Some dogs bonded quickly under trauma, but this felt like something else. Something rare. Something rooted deeper than reason. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. Olivia made phone calls. The fire chief stopped by to check in, leaving behind a donation envelope and a note that simply said, "For the fighter." But still, there was no certainty. The vet had stabilized the bleeding, but the dog's body had been through too much. It wasn't just medicine he needed, it was will. And that couldn't be administered through a needle. Olivia sat beside Mia, rubbing her daughter's back in slow circles, unsure of what to say. She tried to shield her from so much in life: harsh news, real pain, death. But somehow, her daughter had walked into the center of all three and hadn't flinched. She'd faced it with nothing but a soft voice and the belief that something broken could still be okay. Eventually, Dr. Reyes stepped into the waiting room. Her expression didn't give anything away, which in itself was an answer. She crouched beside Mia, meeting her at eye level, her voice gentle. "He's resting now," she said. "He's very tired, but he's trying." Mia nodded, pressing her bunny tighter to her chest. Then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, she looked at the vet and asked, "Can I sit with him?" Dr. Reyes hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Only for a little while," she said. "But yes, I think he'd like that." And as the doors opened again and Mia disappeared into the soft glow of the clinic hallway, Olivia followed behind her with slow steps. Something in her chest shifted. The kind of shift that happens when you realize that some battles aren't won with strength or speed, but with presence, with showing up, and staying. The clinic began to feel like a second home, not just for Olivia and Mia, but for the quiet dog who now had a name, Rusty. It was Mia who chose it without asking anyone. She whispered it through the glass of the recovery room as if the dog had been waiting all this time for someone to remind him who he was. "Rusty," she had said on her third visit, dragging her favorite pink blanket behind her, the one with faded cartoon stars and a tear near the corner. And somehow, in that simple naming, something shifted. No one questioned it. From that day on, every nurse, every technician, even Dr. Reyes, began calling him Rusty. Each morning, Mia insisted on returning. No matter how early it was or how tired she felt, she woke up, packed a small plastic bag with crayons, folded papers filled with messy shapes and stick figures, and always brought something for Rusty. Sometimes it was her stuffed bunny, sometimes crackers she never expected him to eat, sometimes a flower she'd picked from the sidewalk. Olivia tried to reason with her, suggesting every other day, or short visits only, but Mia wouldn't bend. She seemed to believe, with the certainty only a child could have, that Rusty needed her presence as much as the oxygen tubes and 4 drips. At first, Rusty didn't respond. He lay motionless inside his transparent recovery kennel, surrounded by beeping monitors and soft towels. His body was still too broken, too heavy with exhaustion to move. But Mia didn't seem discouraged. She would walk in quietly, press her hand gently against the glass, and sit cross-legged on the floor. Sometimes she would talk. Sometimes she would draw. Other times she would simply hum a tune that had no words, something like a lullaby invented for this moment and this dog alone. And over time, those moments became something more. The staff started noticing changes that didn't match the chart. Rusty's vitals were stabilizing faster than expected. His breathing grew stronger. His eyes, once dull and glassy, began to follow movement in the room, but only when Mia was present. A nurse mentioned it first in passing. "He watches her." Then the vet tech confirmed, showing Olivia a recorded clip from the night before. Mia had placed her small drawing against the glass, a crude sketch of a brown dog and a girl holding hands, and as if drawn to it, Rusty's tail gave the faintest thump against the bedding. No one believed it at first, but then it happened again, and again. By the end of the week, Rusty had begun blinking more frequently when Mia was near. The muscles in his face, especially around the eyes, would twitch slightly when she entered. He still couldn't stand. He still wouldn't eat unless syringe-fed. But the signs were there. Subtle, small, but undeniable. The clinic staff, used to treating numbers and symptoms, found themselves quieting their steps when Mia visited, as though not to interrupt whatever magic was happening. One morning, Olivia walked into the clinic holding Mia's hand, her other arm carrying the blanket that Mia had refused to leave home without. It was the same blanket she'd offered Rusty through the glass every day, pressing it against the wall in hopes he could feel it. Dr. Reyes met them at the front and gave a small, tired smile. She looked over at the girl, then down the hallway toward the kennel. "Let's see what happens today," she said softly. That day was different. Mia placed the blanket neatly on the floor beside the kennel and then pressed her palm against the glass, her eyes soft, her lips forming the name she had given him days before. "Rusty." For a long while, nothing happened. Olivia, standing behind her, prepared herself for the same quiet, slow visit. But then, with no warning, Rusty stirred. His paw shifted. His nose twitched once. And then, slowly, as if pulled by some invisible string, his head lifted off the bed. It didn't rise high, barely an inch, but enough that his neck tensed and his ears flicked forward. His eyes, still lined with exhaustion, looked directly at Mia's hand. And then he let it drop back down again, as though the effort had taken everything he had. But it was enough. Mia gasped quietly, a sound that caught in her throat like a held breath finally let go. She looked up at Olivia with wide, shining eyes and whispered, "He saw me." From that day forward, Rusty responded more clearly. He lifted his head again the next morning, this time longer. His tail gave a weak but definite wag each time Mia entered the room. Olivia watched it all unfold with awe, unsure if what she was seeing was real or some kind of miracle born from a child's belief. But the medical charts didn't lie. Rusty's appetite slowly returned. He began responding to light, to touch, to sound, only Mia's at first, but eventually to others too. The swelling in his joints receded, and the wound near his hip began to heal. He still had a long way to go. But the difference was clear. Even Dr. Reyes, who had once been skeptical about his survival, admitted in her quiet, clinical tone that there were some things medicine couldn't explain. "He's improving faster than I expected," she said one evening while reviewing his file. "And every time she walks through those doors, something in him lights up." She paused, then added with a smile, "Whatever she's doing, we're keeping it in the treatment plan." The bond between them was no longer just remarkable, it was central. Mia's presence became part of Rusty's routine. The staff adjusted schedules around her visits. Volunteers stepped aside when she arrived. Olivia, though still cautious, had stopped questioning it. She sat nearby each time, reading a book or watching quietly as her daughter, without any effort or instruction, helped rebuild a life that had almost slipped away. And as the weeks unfolded and the warmth of spring deepened into summer, the walls of the clinic slowly turned into pages of a new story. One where healing didn't just come from stitches and fluids, but from crayons, small hands, and the unwavering belief of a child who refused to stop showing up. The sun had barely risen when two officers from animal control arrived at the drainage site, clipboards in hand, boots thick with mud, and eyes scanning the tall grass like hunters chasing a fading trail. Days had passed since Rusty's rescue, but the image of his body wedged inside that narrow, rust-stained pipe had haunted everyone who had seen it. Now, questions that had quietly stirred in the background, whispers between firefighters, uneasy glances exchanged by the vet staff, were starting to solidify into something more disturbing. Olivia had made the call, urging the authorities to search the area more thoroughly. "Something's not right," she had said. And she was right. The two officers crouched beside the pipe, now partially dismantled, its sharp edges dulled and folded like a gutted metal snake. What was once a sealed tomb had become an open wound in the earth. With gloved hands and long-handled tools, they pushed deeper inside, following the bend of the tunnel that curved away from view, disappearing beneath the soil like a buried secret. The flashlight beam bounced off the inner walls, revealing patches of rust, streaks of something darker, blood, maybe, and long, jagged scratch marks. Then came the fur, clumps of it, tangled, matted, wedged into cracks like someone or something had tried to climb or claw their way out. The officers didn't speak at first. They simply looked at each other and then kept moving forward. They pulled out what they could, a broken leather collar piece with half a buckle still attached, a shattered tag worn smooth from friction, and deeper still, bite marks along the wall, caning, desperate. This wasn't just a pipe someone had crawled into by accident. This was something else. The trap. A grave. A place no one was meant to survive. Back at the clinic, Dr. Reyes received the first photos on her phone. She didn't flinch, but her mouth pressed into a thin, pale line as she showed them to Olivia. "He wasn't the first," she said quietly. "He's just the one who lived." The images told a story more chilling than anyone expected. Rusty hadn't simply fallen in. He'd been forced. Buried alive in a space meant to be unseen. Olivia stared at the photographs in silence, her thoughts spiraling back to the moment Mia had first heard the whimper in the wind. What if she hadn't? What if no one had listened to that faint, broken cry? Animal control expanded their investigation. Neighbors were interviewed. Construction records were pulled. The pipe wasn't city property. It was part of an old drainage system from when the neighborhood was first built, long since forgotten and overgrown. No one maintained it. No one paid attention. It had become invisible, a perfect place for cruelty to hide. And someone had known that. The broken collar, now cleaned and bagged, bore the faint remnants of stamping. A serial number, maybe. The tech team tried to trace it. They didn't find a name, but they found something else. A missing pet report from 3 months ago. Same breed. Similar size. Same area. That dog had never been found. Until now. Back in the recovery room, Rusty stirred again. He was healing slowly, but each day brought a little more life back into his bones. His appetite had returned in small bites. He could now stand, though briefly. And every time Mia arrived, he moved toward the glass with just a bit more purpose. His eyes no longer seemed to plead for escape. They searched, connected, recognized. He wasn't afraid anymore. But he was still changed. The trauma hadn't left his bones. It lingered in the way he flinched when metal clanked, in how he refused to lie near walls or corners, in how he panicked at the sound of running water. These weren't quirks. These were memories trapped in his muscles. Mia had taken to drawing again, this time images of Rusty as a superhero. She taped them on the clinic walls, right next to the door where everyone could see. Rusty with a cape, Rusty flying, Rusty smiling. Her pictures didn't show the pipe. They showed what came after, what he was becoming. But even as hope grew inside the clinic walls, outside, the investigation deepened. Animal control confirmed multiple layers of fur from different dogs, some old, degraded beyond DNA tracing. It wasn't just Rusty. Others had died there. And that made the pipe more than a place of suffering. It made it a crime scene. The authorities put up barriers. Yellow tape fluttered weakly in the breeze. Neighbors watched with wide, guilty eyes. No one had noticed. Or maybe no one had wanted to. When Olivia told Mia about the other dogs, her daughter didn't cry. She just held Rusty's paw gently and whispered something no one else could hear. Maybe it was a promise. Maybe it was an apology. But Rusty responded. His tail thudded weakly once against the mat, a sound like a heartbeat rising. And so, the truth came quietly, not in breaking news alerts or sirens, but in reports filed, in photos examined under fluorescent lights, in the soft voices of rescue workers who had seen this before but still hoped not to see it again. The pipe had been a graveyard. Rusty was never supposed to walk out of it. But he had. And now, because he lived, others might too. The story was never meant to travel beyond the quiet stretch of suburban road where it began, but some stories have a way of slipping through fences and headlines like wind through grass. Within days of Rusty's rescue, a local reporter picked up the details. First just a blurb on a small website, then a feature with a photo of Mia sitting cross-legged outside the clinic, her hand pressed against the recovery kennel where Rusty lay. The image was striking in its simplicity. A tiny girl, eyes wide and clear, next to a battered dog that had somehow survived the worst of human cruelty. The headline beneath it read, "Toddler finds dog trapped in pipe, saves him." And that was all it took. From there, the story moved quickly. Regional news stations aired short segments. Social media feeds filled with reposts and hashtags. Messages poured into the clinic inbox, some offering donations, others asking for updates, and a few just wanting to say thank you. Stuffed toys began arriving in cardboard boxes addressed to Mia, though no one knew how the senders had found the clinic's address. Someone dropped off a painted stone with the word "Hope" etched in white cursive. A retired firefighter mailed a handmade dog collar engraved with "Hero." And almost every day, strangers brought treats for Rusty, soft biscuits, plush toys, blankets, all tied with ribbons. But attention came with shadows too. Some voices online questioned how a 3-year-old had gotten so close to danger. Comments surfaced about Olivia's parenting. "Who lets a toddler near a pipe like that?" one said. "She could have been bitten," said another. A few even accused the family of staging it for attention. Olivia didn't reply. She read them all quietly, then closed her laptop and turned her focus back to the one thing that mattered: Mia's unflinching gaze and the steady rise and fall of Rusty's chest. At the clinic, the staff moved like guardians. They filtered messages, screened visitors, and created a small sign at the front door that read, "Healing in progress. Please respect their time." Dr. Reyes handled media inquiries with the calm of someone used to pressure but unused to fame. In a short interview, she spoke only briefly about the case before shifting her attention to what she called the real story. "This wasn't about luck," she had said. "It was about timing, instinct, and a bond between a child and an animal that medicine alone couldn't explain." She didn't mention the word miracle, but others did. Back at home, life took on a strange rhythm. Olivia tried to maintain normalcy for Mia's sake, but their daily visits to the clinic had become more than routine. They were ritual. Each morning, Mia chose a new drawing to bring. Each night, She asked if Rusty had eaten. The local bakery began leaving cookies on their porch with notes written in purple ink. For the bravest little girl we know. Still, Olivia made sure to keep the world from pushing in too hard. The media might spin it as heroism, as something spectacular, but for her and Mia, it was always something simpler. A little girl heard a sound, followed it, and refused to walk away. In town, people talked. At grocery stores, parks, sidewalks, whispers of, "Did you hear about that girl?" passed from one voice to the next. The mayor's office sent a letter of recognition. A local children's hospital invited Mia to visit. Even the animal control officers, usually so buried in bureaucracy and cruelty, began showing up with softer eyes and slower words when they came to check in. Rusty, they admitted, had changed them. But not everyone welcomed the attention. A few neighbors grumbled that the spotlight was unnecessary. Some said it would fade like all stories do. Others warned that getting involved always led to complications. Olivia didn't argue. She simply kept showing up, with her daughter in one hand and Rusty's recovery notes in the other. The vet staff watched the entire thing unfold with quiet awe. It wasn't just that Rusty was healing. It was the way he healed. Faster, stronger, steadier than anyone expected. He had begun walking short distances now, especially when Mia was near. His fur was growing back, though scars still lined his legs. But his eyes had changed most of all. Where once there had been fog and flinching, now there was clarity. Alertness. Dr. Reyes called it a soul bond during a staff meeting one evening. Not in jest or sentiment, but with the certainty of someone who had seen something rare. They found each other in the middle of something terrible, she said, and now they're holding each other together. As the town kept talking, some with wonder, some with judgment, Olivia sat quietly beside Mia at the clinic, watching her daughter read from a picture book to a dog that had once been left to die in a pipe. And she realized that the world could say whatever it wanted. Headlines could rise and fall. Praise could come and criticism could follow. But what Mia had done wasn't for applause. It wasn't for anyone else. It was for Rusty. And in the end, that was enough. The clinic had grown quieter over the past few weeks, not because there were fewer patients, but because everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something. Rusty had become the center of that quiet, the stillness around him not born of fear anymore, but of hope. His recovery had been slow, stubborn, like winter thawing one layer at a time. First came the flick of his ears, then the gentle lift of his head, then the tail, soft and cautious like it wasn't sure wagging was allowed. But the step, the first real step, had remained just out of reach. Each day, Mia came as she always did. She would walk into the clinic holding her latest drawing, her pink shoes always slightly scuffed, her backpack swinging from one shoulder. She never rushed. She never pushed. She simply arrived, placed her blanket by the kennel, and waited. Rusty, still favoring his right leg, would lift his head the moment he sensed her near. And then they'd sit, together in stillness, sometimes in story, sometimes in song. Rehab had begun gently. The staff, under Dr. Reyes' careful plan, had introduced light stretching, assisted standing, and finally, short moments outside the kennel with support. Rusty didn't like it. The harness scared him. The metal tools made him flinch. But he tolerated it, for Mia. Whenever she was nearby, his trembling slowed. His eyes stopped darting toward the door. It was like her presence gave his battered nerves a reason to breathe. Then came the morning when everything changed. The sun was barely up, casting long golden slants across the linoleum floors. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh coffee, but the room where Rusty stayed felt like a world apart. Mia walked in wearing a soft blue hoodie and carrying a new drawing. This one was a picture of her holding Rusty's leash, both of them smiling under a big yellow sun. Olivia followed quietly behind, offering the staff a tired but hopeful nod. Dr. Reyes met them by the door, her eyes already scanning the dog curled up on the mat. "He's stronger today," she whispered. "You might see something." No one else was told. No announcements were made. It was just a normal morning. Until it wasn't. Mia placed her picture on the floor just beside her blanket and knelt as she always did. "Hi, Rusty," she said softly, voice barely more than breath. Rusty blinked. His ears twitched. Then, without help, he shifted. Slowly, painfully, he pressed his weight into his front paws and began to lift. At first it looked like he might collapse again. His back leg trembled, and his body shook with the strain, but he didn't fall. He stood. Behind the glass window, two vet techs gasped. Rusty looked at Mia, his chest rising and falling quickly now, but not from fear. His tail lifted, and then he moved. Not much. Just one step. Then another. A slow limp, but toward her. His body favored the injured side, his gait awkward and uneven, but the direction was clear. He was walking. He was choosing. Mia didn't cry out or clap. She didn't run to him. She simply waited, her hand resting gently on her blanket, her eyes wide with quiet joy. When Rusty reached her, he stopped. His head lowered, and he pressed it softly against her knees. And finally, Mia reached out and touched his fur, not through glass, not through fear, but in full presence. Solid. Behind the observation window, the staff stood in still silence. One of the nurses had tears streaming down her cheeks. Dr. Reyes, who had once delivered a near-hopeless prognosis, closed her eyes briefly and whispered something no one heard. Olivia gripped her hands tightly in front of her chest, a smile breaking across her face, so full of relief it almost hurt. Outside, word spread quickly. A few neighbors had stopped by with treats that morning, hoping for a glimpse of Mia and Rusty. When they saw the dog, frail but walking, broken but moving, they stood still, humbled by the quiet miracle. A father lifted his daughter so she could peer through the window. A retired teacher placed her hand over her mouth. No one said a word. In that moment, it wasn't about recovery or rescue or rehab anymore. It was about presence, about trust. A child who had followed a sound no one else heard. A dog who had every reason to give up but didn't. And the space between them, where something unspoken lived, soft, steady, and unbreakable. Rusty curled up beside Mia, his head on her lap. He sighed, deep and slow. And though his bones still ached and the world still carried shadows, he knew one thing for certain. He had taken his first step back into the world. And he had taken it for her. What started as a story about a trapped dog and a brave little girl slowly turned into something much larger, something no one had predicted. At first, it was just a few envelopes. A woman from the next town sent a short handwritten note about the beagle she had rescued as a child and still missed. Then came a letter from a teenager who had watched Mia's story online and shared how her own dog had helped her through depression. Within a week, the clinic's front desk was buried in stacks of mail. Postcards, folded notebook pages, crayon drawings, typed letters from veterans, from widows, from children who had lost their first pet and never stopped dreaming about them. Each one addressed not to the vet or even to the clinic, but to Rusty and Mia. The staff, overwhelmed at first, began taping them to the wall behind the reception desk. When that filled up, they spilled down the hallway. Then the waiting room. Soon, the clinic became a place not just of healing, but of remembrance, of love and loss and second chances. Every message carried something deeply personal, stories of rescues that didn't work out, of animals saved at the last second, of guilt, of hope, of gratitude. The walls, once sterile and pale, now held color and warmth. Olivia came in one morning to find a child's drawing of a dog with wings hovering over a little girl. In the corner, written in pencil, were the words, "Rusty gave me courage." Mia didn't understand all the words, but she understood the feeling. She walked past the letters slowly each time, her small hand grazing the paper edges, eyes pausing on the ones with big handwriting or stickers. Sometimes she'd stop to place her latest drawing beside a stranger's letter, as if offering something back. Her favorites were always the ones with dogs drawn in capes, or wearing crowns, or smiling next to children. It made her giggle softly, and Rusty, sensing her joy, would always raise his head from his blanket, watching with that patient, grateful gaze that seemed to grow deeper every day. Inspired by the growing attention, the clinic started a leash donation drive. It was Olivia's idea, written in the margins of her grocery list one night after reading a letter from a woman who had once had to tie her rescue dog with a jump rope because she couldn't afford a proper leash. No animal should have to start their second chance tied with whatever's lying around, she had said quietly to Dr. Reyes, who immediately agreed. The next morning, a plastic bin was placed outside the clinic with a laminated sign, "Leashes of Love, donate new or gently used." By the end of the week, the bin overflowed. Some people dropped off bright, brand new leashes still in packaging. Others left faded but clean ones, softened by years of use and meaning. One elderly man stood silently at the door, placing a red leather leash with worn stitching into the box. He didn't say a word, but before leaving, he placed his hand gently on the clinic's glass door and stood there for a moment, eyes closed. Olivia worked with the clinic staff to create a small awareness flyer they could include in thank you letters and post around town. It was simple, a black and white silhouette of a child reaching out to a dog, with the words, "Even a whisper can save a life," written underneath. Below that, in smaller text, was the name of the growing initiative, the Rusty and Mia Project. What began as a moment of survival had turned into a movement. Local businesses offered to help. A bookstore created a small display of animal rescue memoirs and offered to donate part of the sales to the clinic. A bakery sent cupcakes decorated with tiny paw prints. A schoolteacher requested permission to use Mia's story in a writing project for her fourth graders, who were then encouraged to write their own rescue stories. Some were real, some imagined. All of them were heartfelt. But perhaps the most powerful moment came quietly. One afternoon, while organizing the mail that had come in, Olivia opened a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a single piece of lined paper. Written in shaky handwriting were just 5 words. "I failed my dog. Sorry." There was no name, no signature, just that one sentence. Olivia stared at it for a long while, her throat tightening. She taped it up near the bottom corner of the wall, not to hide it, but to anchor the rest. Because that was what this movement had become, not just a celebration of rescue, but a place where pain and regret could come too, could find a place to rest. As the days passed and Rusty grew stronger, his walks longer and steps surer, the world he had once been left to die in was now rising around him with light and love. He still bore the scars inside and out, but now he bore them surrounded by color, by messages, by the weight of strangers who somehow, despite never knowing him, saw something of themselves in his story. And through it all, Mia remained at the center, not loud, not performative, but steady, present. Her bravery had not come from knowing what to do, but from simply refusing to walk away. From believing, even in her silence, that the cry she heard mattered, that the life beneath the rust was still worth saving. The rusted pipe was never supposed to be remembered. It had lain half-buried under tall grass and weeds, forgotten by city plans and ignored by passing footsteps. It wasn't on any map, didn't belong to any official structure, and carried no purpose anymore, except one. It had been the place where a life was almost lost, and unexpectedly, where many hearts were awakened. After the flood of attention, the town council had little choice but to take notice. What had once been just a drainage issue was now a site of meaning. Quiet visits began, people walking past the old ditch, parents pointing to where the dog in the story had been trapped, children leaving notes in sandwich bags weighed down with rocks. The town wasn't just talking anymore. It was remembering, honoring. So plans changed. Construction crews arrived early on a gray morning. The grass was cut back. The remaining pipe, now buckled from the rescue and rusted beyond repair, was carefully removed, not with indifference, but with respect. The workers moved slower than usual, as if understanding that they weren't just clearing debris, they were making space for something deeper, something sacred. A new drainage system was installed, sleeker, safer, and properly mapped. But that wasn't the part anyone paid attention to. Just a few feet from where the old pipe had once opened its black mouth to the earth, a concrete base was poured. On top of it, a sculpture was placed, small, simple, and perfect. It showed a child sitting cross-legged, one hand resting gently on the back of a seated dog. The two weren't looking at each other, they were looking outward, as if facing a world they had survived together. Not flashy, not grand, just still. At the base of the statue was a bronze plaque. The letters were etched clean and clear. He was found in silence and saved by love. When Mia saw the statue for the first time, she didn't say anything. She just walked up to it slowly, Rusty at her side, now stronger, his fur fuller, his steps surer. She placed her small hand on the dog's sculpted back, mirroring the image exactly. Rusty sniffed the base, then sat quietly next to her, as if sensing that this place, this very ground, held part of his story. The ceremony wasn't formal. There were no speeches, no officials, just townspeople, dozens of them. Some brought their dogs. Some brought flowers. Others brought nothing but soft expressions and long silences. Olivia stood at the edge of the crowd, watching her daughter with a mix of wonder and disbelief. What began as a sound in the wind had become a symbol carved in stone. The vet staff came too. Dr. Reyes stood beside the memorial for a long time, her hand resting on the sculpture's bronze paw, eyes filled with a depth of emotion she rarely let show. She leaned in and whispered something no one heard, then turned away with a soft smile. Others left notes folded in the grass. A drawing, a photo of a lost pet, a crumpled dog tag placed gently under the statue's feet. And as the sun began to dip behind the rooftops, something changed in the air. The shadows didn't feel as heavy. The wind didn't carry weight. Even the silence, the same silence that once held a trapped whimper, now felt full, warm, grateful. Like it had been given purpose. Rusty lay down at Mia's feet, his eyes closing peacefully. He wasn't just healed. He was whole. That evening, Olivia took a picture of the statue. In the foreground was Mia, hands still resting on the dog's back. In the background, a pink sunset spread across the sky like a painting done by a child's brush. She posted the photo to the clinic's page with no caption, just the image. It didn't need words anymore, because the story had already been told, not in headlines, not in comments, but in steel, in stone, and in the quiet space between a girl and her dog. The morning of the one-year anniversary came soft and golden, as if the town itself knew what it was waking up to. The clouds moved slow, the wind didn't rush, and even the birdsong felt gentler. Outside the community center, rows of folding chairs lined the path that led toward the new memorial. Balloons, dog leashes, and handwritten signs fluttered in the breeze. Rescue. Remember. Repeat. Read one banner. Another said, "From rust to rise." But no sign drew more attention than the smallest one, Mia and Rusty, hero and heart. Mia arrived holding Olivia's hand, her other hand tightly wrapped around a bright red leash. On the end of it, walking just a little behind with a proud but cautious step, was Rusty. His coat had grown thick and soft, a faint ridge of healed scars still visible beneath, but no longer defining him. What once was hollow in him had been filled, with time, with care, and most of all, with Mia's unyielding presence. He was no longer the dog found trapped in a pipe. He was the dog that survived and walked forward. Volunteers waved. Strangers smiled. Dogs barked playfully around the grassy edges. The event was simple: a fundraiser walk for local rescues, a few short speeches, and a moment to honor the story that sparked it all. But for those who had followed the journey from the beginning, it wasn't just an event, it was a living chapter. The transformation of a moment into a movement. When it was time for the short presentation, Mia stood on a small wooden platform beside Dr. Reyes and Olivia. A gentle hush fell over the crowd. Someone handed her a tiny microphone. She looked down at Rusty beside her, then up at the rows of faces, unfamiliar, kind, waiting. Olivia leaned in to whisper something, but Mia stepped forward before she could. She took a breath, and then clearly, simply said, "I just didn't want him to be alone." That was it. No speeches, no practiced lines, just truth. The kind that didn't need to be explained. The audience fell quiet, not out of awkwardness or confusion, but because there was nothing else to add. A few people wiped their eyes. Others looked down at the dogs beside them and pulled their leashes just a little closer. Some clasped hands. And then, slowly, the crowd began to clap, not loudly, not as celebration, but as gratitude. Mia stepped back into Olivia's arms. Rusty sat beside them, tall and still. Later that night, as the town settled back into its normal rhythm and the last folding chair was packed away, the real magic happened in the quiet. At home, in her small room with fairy lights strung above the windows, Mia changed into her pajamas and crawled into bed. Rusty followed her, as he had every night since the day he came home. He curled into the space between the wall and the edge of the blanket, letting out a long sigh that filled the room with comfort. No whimper, no flinch, no fear, just warmth, just home. Olivia stood in the doorway watching them, the girl who heard a cry in the wind and the dog who answered it by surviving. She thought about the long year that had passed, the hospital visits, the sleepless nights, the letters, the statue, the walks. And through it all, she thought about what had never changed. Mia never asked for praise. She never wanted to be called brave. She just wanted Rusty to live. That was all. And somehow, in that small, innocent wish, she had moved an entire town. The next morning, a new article appeared in the local paper. The headline read, "Hero of the Hollow, How One Toddler Changed a Town." But Mia never saw it. She was too busy wrapping a new blanket around Rusty, whispering something only he could hear, and starting her next drawing. Another picture of them, side by side, standing in the sun. The most unexpected moments can change us forever. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Until next time, stay open to the wonders around you.